not like occupying a lunch counter where business cannot go on. I mean, it means people, rich people couldn't be in Zuccotti Park as frequently as they were used to. They were whining about it. You could get into and out of LA City Hall, but you had to look at all these tents and feel ashamed of yourself. But there was nothing was interrupted. It was more, here's where the media comes in, converging with movements. It was more in the realm of symbolic performance art than the activists would like to say. It comes straight out of Adbusters magazine in Vancouver, that somehow the war is in the realm of the superstructure of culture. And you have to interrupt advertising and imagery and change the meme. They have all these weird concepts. I mean weird in the sense that if you're organizing people, you don't say, let's change the meme. They think that means you're aunt. Like, who's your meme? So once they had it that way, then, you know, you're going to draw mentally ill homeless people because they're on the streets. And then all of a sudden, one wing of the movement thinks they're the revolutionary vanguard, the mentally ill homeless, who have not been the revolutionary vanguard for 25 years or 30 since Reagan emptied the institutions. So why would they suddenly become glorified? And then, you know, one of every 5 or 10 people was a cop in LA. Nice cops, just listening to everyone, making notes. So you couldn't tell who you were talking to. Meetings could never come to a conclusion. And pretty soon the goal of the meetings was not to occupy Wall Street. The goal of the meetings was to maintain the community, feed people, sleep people, protect people, health care, put up a little library, have a Tom Hayden and a Noam Chomsky book in the library so people could read. It became an end in its own, straight out of 1937 anarchist manuals. And it just wasn't going to happen. I said, this isn't going to happen. What they could have done in theory, but you know in practice it was never going to happen, was use the occupation centers and parks as a launching pad to do something else. And a few places they tried to, you know, go march on the banks or financial institutions, but that wasn't, you know, that wasn't in the air. You can only do what is going to happen anyway. You can't like just tell people, let's do X when they're quite satisfied with Y. And like with the sit-ins, they've stopped Woolworths and Kresge's, and they started to block downtown shopping in Atlanta, Birmingham, Charlotte, these towns. So the business community started to waver, and they also had the federal government somewhat on their side because segregation was theoretically against the law. So you had business community saying, we have to do something. And the federal government saying, you have to do something. And the students occupying, just all they had to do was keep occupying and the pressure would build. And finally, they desegregated downtowns. They desegregated interstate travel. Occupying a park is not the same thing.
Well, it's not direct action. It's only direct action if, I mean, WTO protests were direct action.
Yeah.
They literally and physically prevented the delegates from having access to the meetings.
Well, I've often wondered this. What do you think? Are some things destined and inevitable? Like you could criticize Wall Street and say they should have done this, should have done it, but they didn't. So I start to conclude that wasn't really possible. Other people say, no, with the right leadership, quote unquote, they could have, you know, had Van Jones get arrested on the steps of a bank, stay in jail, 100 people get arrested the next day, 1,000 people the next day, 10,000 people get arrested, slowly bring New York to a standstill. Every one of them should have demanded a trial by a jury, which would have paralyzed the judicial system. until Wall Street gave up and made a concession. That's what I would have done. But since it didn't happen, I actually think it wasn't possible.
Well, what, I mean,
I just have a hard time believing
Well, were you
other choices are
surprised-
possible.
Were you surprised at starting for me?
Huh?
I felt like it was inevitable that something was going to happen on Occupy, but when Occupy actually did happen,
Yeah.
I was surprised that it happened at that moment. I thought things would have to be worse before people would put themselves on the line. And maybe that's why inevitably it didn't sustain, because people had other things they had to deal with in their life, or they were still comfortable and weren't ready to risk everything. But if things go in the trajectory that they're going, and that the ones that aren't the 1%, just the quality of life gets so bad that the next round might be something more.
Yeah, I think that's the way to see it, that Occupy was a step, a big step. But it was overwhelmed by what it was up against. And since conditions will not improve, assuming they don't improve, then Occupy will come back in a new form. But I can't tell you what the form is. One thing you might research is, I've never heard of a social movement that was predicted by a newspaper before it happened. Have you? I've never heard of one. If we're so smart, why can't we predict it? Where do they come from? I know where they come from, but they're not discernible to journalists. And then when it happens, then the coverage begins. I guess you'd be in trouble if you said, let me write a news story predicting that on February 1st there will be a new Occupy movement in New York. You can't get it past an editor, and it's very hard to conceive. Were you in one of the Occupy?
Oh yeah, I started my coverage like day 10.
Where? What day?
New York City. I flew up from New Orleans. When it got gassed, I booked a plane ticket and got my ass up there.
Uh-huh.
And then I kept covering right up and coming here. I was in New York, but all around I was in Chicago and Tampa and Oakland, mostly in New York though. But what I think when you said about the New York Times covering it, I think that what happened with all that coverage early on is that the police bungled things so badly that people like me got on a plane, a bunch of myself, and covered it. Because I thought, wow, if they're that crazy, that's not acceptable, especially after being in Tahrir Square. So that by the following week when the Brooklyn Bridge happened, that it was just synergy that all that coverage. If the police had not done that on the Brooklyn Bridge, I don't think the movement would have happened. We'll never know, but I think it was the police bungling, so it was interesting to follow it up through Chicago and watch how insanely police state that. It was the only story for me in Chicago really was the police state of the city. It was disgusting and scary, and the resources and the horses would.
do you have a for NATO?
Yeah, for NATO. And that was so downplayed, and it wasn't picked up how much
Right.
money and all. And the same in Tampa, there must have been 10 to 15 police for every protester, the way you really saw it as
No,
they
they-
left. It was crazy.
Well, there's a formula since Seattle. It goes like this. When another large one comes, the FBI tells the local police that there's a group of 50 anarchists coming from somewhere who will trigger another 1,000 anarchists. They're intent on rioting and property destruction. And what you should do is take $50 million from the federal government to buy weapons and surveillance cameras, which, by the way, will be used permanently, not just for 3 days.
Right.
Secondly, follow the advice of the FBI counterterrorism units who know more than the local police department or the mayors. So cede your sensible civic authority to outside police force. Then identify, target, and arrest 3 teenagers just before the event and declare that they're conspiracy to commit terrorism. Make sure you drop the charges after the event because it's costly to go through these trials. It's embarrassing that they always get off. then during the event, give them a protest sector, which is like a trap, a jail, where they have to go in. When they refuse that, say they've given up their First Amendment rights, therefore we will order them off the streets, having given them a First Amendment option. I was to speak at a nurses rally, and the script was being followed. Still no permits, still no permits, still no permits. And through the nurses in Morello, I had some link to the Democrats and Labor in Chicago, and I kept saying, this is really stupid. This is the voice of Chicago 68. You were doing something really, really stupid, and you're going to embarrass the reputation of the city for the second time in our generation, and there's an alternative. You don't have to march to follow. What's the alternative? Well, how about let the nurses have their goddamn rally? Trust the nurses. They have no... And the nurses are, now they're divided into factions. They're telling me, if we're not permitted, good, we're going to march without a permit. I said, no, just you'll get a permit. They said, it won't be good enough, it won't be long enough. But sure enough, at the last minute, the permit came through. 5,000 nurses. Morello played some incendiary, wild, anarchist music. Best string guitar player of our times. A hero to my 12-year-old child. And everybody went away. I said, see, it's not going to happen. And then what happened then was they gave the permit for the big march, but they made a deal where the police could get their pound of flesh.
At the end, yeah.
Yeah, at the end. So here comes this gigantic march down the streets with huge fortifications on both sides. The marchers have agreed by internal consensus that they're not there to riot, but they want to show numbers. They've figured out that if there's going to be a riot, nobody's going to come. If there's going to be a militant march with banners, then more people will come. Brilliant. Police don't believe that, so they have on both sides. But at the end, two groups, one very tiny handful of more anarchist people who wanted to get it on with the police.
Very small group.
And the police who really wanted to beat somebody up, they got into this battle. And everybody came away saying, we crushed them, or they oppressed us. But actually, it was a trade-off between two forces that could not be reconciled. And I thought it was a pretty impressive march. That so many people.
If you had been in the front line, you might not get that way.
But I don't know how many.
But no, it was great.
How many people do you think were there?
That march, 30,000.
I thought it was big.
It was huge.
Because the mayor and the police wanted to cut it down to 2,500. They thought for sure that with enough intimidation they would reduce the numbers.
I do think they did, because a lot of the people I knew in Chicago left. They didn't want to have.
Yeah, that's right.
It was
But
all
they
out
still,
of towners.
but they still had 20, 30, 40,000 people.
Yeah.
I thought it was pretty impressive. And what was it about? It was ridiculous. It came and went. It was good. But the authorities were terrified. They
Right.
shook their pants.
Well, I mean, that was the angle of my story at the end, is how can they, if they're surveilling everyone and they know more or less who's coming, how could they justify the expense? And that for me is the story.
How could they justify?
The expense they spent beforehand, all those horses with their, and that's really the issue. Where is that money not being spent?
Yeah. Good luck with that.
Yeah, I know.
People will pay any amount in tax dollars if they're afraid of anarchy. And they never follow through. Where'd the money go exactly? Go for more gas pellets and surveillance cameras. But look, the city didn't burn down, therefore it was money well spent.
Right.
That's a hard narrative to penetrate. It's tough.
Oh yeah, sure, and they did a great job keeping it out of the press by not eating too many heads. But it's interesting. The last time in New York City, on the anniversary, 180 some odd people got arrested. That story was so downplayed. It was remarkable, and they did throw them back out within 7 or 8 hours. The protesters.
Cycled them out. Yeah, I don't know. If you live by the media, die by the media, but you still exist on another level outside the scope of the media, I think.
Yeah, but the New York police didn't
called
behave
life.
like they did in Chicago, though. They didn't let the protesters do what they wanted at all. but I think that the story was already so small that they could go back to their old ways of, saying disperse when they had no reason to.
Let me ask you this, one other question. Do you think there was a conspiracy from Homeland Security to the mayors to shut down the encampments?
Oh, of course.
You do?
Yeah, yeah, oh, totally. I mean, I felt that that was almost public knowledge. They all met together.
No, well, it's a narrative, I don't believe it.
Oh, you don't? Okay.
No,
I have no proof.
I put that in the box of who the hell knows.
Okay.
What I do know is I talked to our mayor, Iragosa, who I suppose because he's a politician is capable of lying to his friends, but I know that he was not on the phone call. I know there were 16 mayors on the phone call. I don't know for sure what happened. I do know that all the mayors in the country were feeling pressure to get rid of the encampment sooner or later because the middle class was starting to be negative. And mayors don't like middle class people. Middle class people don't like grass trampled on. Right? By homeless people.
Yes.
So there was this pressure, but I'm not sure how coordinated it was because the arrests were carried out in different ways. The LA arrest was massive overkill, but relatively it was a light touch. Oakland was rough, really rough.
Oh, yeah. Quick question for you. I really don't know. The money that went to those cities, is that city money, state money, or federal money?
Federal.
Okay, well, there's your answer.
Well, in my case, I always covered Occupy Miami, and I was arrested, and I went to the jails, and I'm very familiar with the jails. But we uncovered emails after my arrest that they're from Homeland Security Bureau, which is a fusion center, that they get funded by the feds.
Right.
That they're monitoring my website and my Facebook page, because I'm not an activist, I'm a journalist, and I write a very so-called controversial site, but they were also monitoring everyone in Occupy Miami, which is part of my public record request. So they were actively monitoring.
Monitoring is one thing, but did they decide that's enough, arrest them all, we'll pay for it?
I believe they did.
And I think it remains to be fully confirmed.
Yeah, oh, no, totally. I mean, there were, I don't know, less than 50 people in New Orleans, and they spent $60,000 or something crazy to get rid of
I
them.
know.
And, oh, it was insane.
No, I know, but it's not their money, they don't care.
Exactly. Well, that makes me think more like a conspiracy.
I think we should take like one last question. So
Yes, this is on a little bit different note, but one of the big questions anytime there's a protest is how many people show up. And so I
Yeah.
just wondered how, like I don't know, like you cover things for the Wall Street Journal, you cover things for the Nation, like how do people, or do you just talk to always the organizers say one thing, the police say something, orders of magnitude different, like how do you figure out how many people show up to something?
Well, I think you can assume that the organizers will overestimate and the police will underestimate. But the criteria is very complicated. It takes time and resources that we don't have. Once I did a Washington march, and I walked the entire march and counted my steps. And I counted the number of people in the line, like, I can't remember, 25, 35, 40. And I had somebody else counting the number of lines. So we came very close to 550,000. So it can be done, but it's very time consuming.
The San Francisco Chronicle during the anti-war protests of 2003 were victims. They actually had a helicopter, and they actually took the picture of Market Street, and they did like a numerical analysis of how many. So they did kind of a
How many in the line, how many lines?
right, and then like in little blocks.
Yeah, you can do that.
Yeah.
Do you know what the LA Times does?
I think now we should, I know it's
I'll
been
never
a
know.
long
That's it.
hour, we should thank Tom for coming down here.
Yeah.